The prison gates opened just after sunrise, and for the first time in 20 years, Merritt Caulfield stepped out a free man. 72 years old, slower than he remembered being, carrying everything he owned in a small plastic bag and a manila envelope that felt lighter than any life should. $87. An expired driver's license with a photograph of a man he barely recognized, a comb with missing teeth, and a brass key on a leather tag worn smooth from 2 decades of handling in the dark. No one came to meet him. A guard had walked him to the gate but didn't offer a handshake. He just pointed down the road and said, "Bus stop's a quarter-mile that way." "Thank you," Merritt said. The guard was already walking back inside. Merritt stood on the gravel shoulder and breathed. The air out here was different. Wet grass and diesel from the highway and something blooming in a ditch alongside the road. Something sweet he couldn't name. Inside, everything had smelled like concrete and bleach for so long that he'd forgotten the world had other options. He'd forgotten that air could carry the memory of rain. That mornings could smell like anything besides industrial cleaning, solution, and the metallic taste of recycled ventilation. He walked. His knees ached from the cold, and his shoes the same pair the state had issued him 4 years ago when his old ones finally fell apart, slapped against the asphalt with the sound that felt too loud for a road this empty. No cars, no people. Just Merritt in the morning in the long stretch of pavement leading away from the place that had held him since he was 52. He reached into the plastic bag without looking and found the key by touch. Brass small, the leather tag cracked and softened by years of his thumb rubbing across it in the dark. He'd kept it in his palm during lights out for more nights than he could count, tracing the ridges of the teeth with his fingertip, memorizing the shape of a door he was afraid to open. 20 years is a long time to hold on to a key, especially when you're not sure anything is waiting on the other side. The bus stop was a metal bench with a cracked slat and a schedule taped behind scratched plastic. Next Greyhound heading south toward Millfield, 40 minutes. Merritt sat down. He set the plastic bag between his feet and the envelope on his lap, and he waited. He was good at waiting. 2 decades had made him an expert at sitting still and letting time pass without expecting anything from it. He closed his eyes, and the memory came without invitation. It always did at the worst times when his defenses were down and his mind had nowhere else to go. October 20 years ago. He'd been 52, still strong in the shoulders, still quick with his hands. He'd stopped at a bar outside town on his way home from a cabinet installation. One beer. He never had more than one because Opal didn't like the smell of alcohol on his shirt, and Merritt Caulfield had spent 30 years arranging his life around what Opal liked and didn't like, not because she demanded it, but because making her comfortable was the closest thing he knew to purpose. He was walking to his truck in the parking lot when he heard it. Not a scream, something worse. The sound of someone trying to scream through a hand clamped over their mouth. A muffled, desperate noise that cut through the quiet of the parking lot like a blade through balsa wood. Behind the bar, in the shadow between the dumpster and a pickup truck, a man twice the size of any reasonable person had a young woman by the arm. He was dragging her toward his vehicle. His right hand covered her mouth and nose. She was kicking, clawing at his forearm, her feet scraping against the gravel. She couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds. He had at least 80 on her. Merritt did not think. That was the detail the prosecution would return to again and again during the trial, the fact that he did not think. He did not call the police. He did not shout from a safe distance. He did not consider the consequences. He simply crossed the parking lot at a dead run, grabbed the man by the collar of his jacket, and wrenched him backward. The man released the woman. She stumbled forward, gasping. The man spun around and drove his fist into Merritt's face, a short, brutal punch that split Merritt's lip against his teeth and filled his mouth with blood. Merritt hit him back. One punch. Right hand closed fist aimed at the jaw. The man's head snapped sideways and his legs folded, and he went down hard. The back of his skull struck the concrete parking barrier with sound Merritt would hear for the rest of his life. A wet, hollow crack like a watermelon dropped on a kitchen floor. The man did not get up. The young woman ran into the dark across the parking lot into the night. She never looked back. She never came forward. She never testified. She vanished as completely as if she had never existed, and she took with her the only evidence that Merritt Caulfield had been doing anything other than killing a man in a parking lot. The man's name was Dale Whitmore. He was 34 years old. His father was a former county commissioner. His family had donated the land for the town's Little League field and had their name on a brass plaque at the public library. Dale Whitmore died of a brain hemorrhage caused by blunt force trauma to the back of the skull before the ambulance arrived. The public defender assigned to Merritt's case was 26 years old, 11 months out of law school, and carrying 47 active cases. He advised Merritt to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter and hope for leniency. There was no security camera. No witness except Merritt and a dead man from a family that owned half the town. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. 20 years. Merritt opened his eyes. The bus stop bench was still under him. The road was still empty. The key was still in his hand. He put it back in the plastic bag and waited. A woman joined him after a few minutes. Gray-haired, a canvas shopping bag on her arm. She glanced at his plastic bag and his state-issued shoes and sat at the far end of the bench without a word. Merritt didn't blame her. He looked like exactly what he was. But the gray hair made him think of Opal. Not the Opal who might exist now wherever she was, but the Opal he kept locked in a room in his mind and hadn't visited in years. Saturday morning, Opal kneeling in the garden behind their house on Cedar Lane, her knees in the dirt, her gloves caked with soil, her brown hair pinned back with a tortoiseshell clip he'd bought her at the county fair the year she turned 30. She used to pick tomatoes, still warm from the sun, and make him taste them right there in the garden, standing between the rows with dirt on both their shoes. Taste it, Merritt. That's not a tomato. That's the sun. She had a small bottle of perfume on her dresser in the bedroom. White shoulders. Every night before bed, she'd dab a drop behind each ear, even on nights when Merritt was working late and wouldn't be home until she was already asleep. He asked her once why she still put it on when he wasn't there to smell it. She said, "Because I know you'll come home." That memory, that perfume, those tomatoes warm from the vine, those were the thing Merritt had sealed behind a locked door in his mind 17 years ago and refused to open. Inside prison, you learn to put the people you love in a room and leave them there. Thinking about them doesn't bring them closer. It just reminds you that the distance is real, and the distance was the thing that could break you if you let it. The bus arrived at 7:15. Merritt paid with a 20 from his envelope. The driver, a heavy man in a Bengals cap, glanced at the bill and punched out a ticket without a word. Merritt took a window seat near the back. The seat smelled like cleaning solution and old upholstery. He pressed his forehead against the glass and watched the world slide past. Everything had changed. The gas station at the county line was gone, replaced by a pharmacy with a drive-through lane. The billboard that used to advertise Earl's Auto Body now showed a phone so thin it looked like a playing card. A school had appeared on a hillside where Merritt remembered nothing but cow pasture and a barbed wire fence. 2 decades of progress rolled by the window, and Merritt watched it all with the quiet disbelief of a man waking from a long and dreamless sleep. He tried to count the years in his head, not the prison years, those he knew by heart, the life years. He'd gone in at 52. He was 72 now. Opal would be 70 if she was still alive. Twyla, their daughter, would be 50. An artist. Twyla's baby girl, the one he'd held in the workshop while she banged a toy hammer against his workbench, giggling every time it bounced. Her tiny fists wrapped around the handle with a grip that surprised him for someone who weighed less than a bag of flour. She'd been 4 years old the last time he saw her. She'd be 24 now. He hadn't let himself think about them in years. The letters had been the last thread, and when they stopped, he'd cut it himself. Opal had written for the first 2 years. Short, careful letters on lined paper in blue ink with her careful slant. She mentioned Twyla's anger, the neighbors who stopped coming by little artists taking her first steps in the living room. The letters arrived every 2 weeks, regular enough that Merritt could set his internal calendar by them. Every other Thursday, the guard would slide an envelope under his door, and for 10 minutes, Merritt would sit on his bunk and hold his wife's handwriting and breathe. Then in the third year, the letter stopped. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence, sudden and complete, like a phone line going dead in the middle of a sentence. Merritt wrote back 3 times. The letters went out through the prison mail system and nothing came in return. He lay awake at night on his bunk, staring at the underside of the mattress above him, wondering what he'd done wrong, what Opal had finally decided she couldn't forgive. Whether it was the punch, or the prison, or the shame, or all of it together piled up until the weight of being married to an inmate was more than she could carry. After the third unanswered letter, he made a decision that would cost him everything he didn't yet know he still had. He walked into the administrative office and told the officer behind the desk that he didn't want family mail anymore. No letters, no visitors, no phone calls, nothing. The officer looked at him over the top of a form. "You sure about that, Caulfield?" "I'm sure." If Opal was done with him, he'd be done with hope. It was the only way he knew to stop the pain. You can't grieve what you've already buried. So he buried them, his wife, his daughter, his granddaughter. He put them in the ground of his mind, and he walked away, and he did not look back for 17 years. The bus crossed into Millfield just before 10 in the morning. Merritt recognized the water tower, rusted and repainted in a shade of blue that hadn't existed when he left. The steeple of the Methodist church rose above the trees, same as always. A strip mall stood where the old feed store had been. The diner on Main Street had a new sign, blue neon, instead of the painted wood he remembered. The trees that lined the main road had grown taller and thicker. In 20 years, their branches stretching across the street to touch the branches on the other side, forming a canopy that filtered the morning light into green and gold. He got off at the transit center and started walking, but not towards Cedar Lane. Not yet. The address on the paper Bernadine Kincaid had mailed to the prison was 3 blocks from the transit center. A low brick building with a county seal on the glass door and the words Division of Parole and Community Supervision in gold letters that were peeling at the edges. Merritt pushed through the door and found a waiting room with plastic chairs and a television mounted on the wall playing a morning talk show with the sound off. A woman behind a plexiglass partition looked up from her computer. Merritt gave his name. She told him to sit. He sat for 40 minutes. The television showed a woman cooking something in a skillet, while a man in a suit laughed silently. A young man in the corner filled out a form with a pencil that had no eraser. The clock on the wall ticked with the kind of aggressive loudness that only institutional clocks achieve. Caulfield. Bernadine Kincaid was about 45. Short hair, gray blazer, glasses with square frames that made her eyes look slightly larger than they were. She led him to a small office with a metal desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. She sat down and opened a folder with his name on the tab. She went through the conditions without warmth and without cruelty. Report weekly. Do not leave the county. No contact with convicted felons. Secure verifiable employment within 30 days. Merritt signed where she pointed. His hand shook. His signature looked nothing like the one on his old driver's license. 20 years of signing nothing but commissary receipts had turned his handwriting into something uncertain, the letters uneven and tentative on the line. Bernadine watched him sign. When he was done, she closed the folder and looked at him directly. Mr. Caulfield, I've seen a lot of people walk through that door. Most of them are back inside within 6 months. I don't hope, and I don't not hope. I just count. Merritt wanted to tell her he was different, but he knew that every man who sat in this chair said the same thing. He nodded and stood up. 30 days, Mr. Caulfield. I need to see a pay stub or an employment contract, not a handshake, not a promise from a friend. Documentation. He walked out of the building into the midday sun. 30 days. The clock was already running. Merritt stood on the sidewalk and looked at the town he used to know. The hardware store on the corner of Main and 2nd was gone. In its place stood a coffee shop with a chalkboard sign on the sidewalk offering something called a lavender latte. The barber shop where he used to get his hair cut every 3rd Saturday was still there, but the name on the window was different and the barber pole was new. The old movie theater with the marquee that always had missing letters had been converted into a fitness studio. Through the plate glass window, Merritt could see rows of stationary bicycles and a woman in spandex shouting instructions to a room full of people pedaling furiously toward nowhere. He passed the post office where Opal used to buy stamps in sheets of 20, always the flag design, never the commemorative ones. She said commemorative stamps were for people who had too much time on their hands. The building looked the same, but the blue mailbox out front had been replaced with a newer model, sleeker with rounded edges, as if even the Postal Service had decided that the old shapes were no longer adequate. A church bell rang somewhere behind the rooftops. Merritt counted the strikes. 11. He had been a free man for 5 hours. Cedar Lane was a 12-minute walk from the transit center. Left on Main right on 4th 3 blocks down to Cedar. Merritt had traced the route 1,000 times in his mind, lying on his bunk at night, walking the streets of Millfield in his imagination, because his body couldn't. He knew every turn, every corner, every crack in the sidewalk that had existed 20 years ago. The cracks were different now. The sidewalks had been repaired in some places and broken in new ones. A woman passed him pushing a stroller. 2 teenagers crossed the street without looking up from their phones. A man hosed down the sidewalk in front of a barber shop and nodded at Merritt as he passed. Nobody recognized him. He was invisible. An old man with a plastic bag walking through a town that had spent 20 years forgetting he existed. His legs were stiff from the 2-hour bus ride and the plastic bag bumped against his hip with every step. He passed a yard where a man was raking leaves that had accumulated against a chain-link fence, working with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who has all day and knows it. The man looked up and their eyes met for a moment, 2 strangers on a Tuesday morning, and then the man went back to his raking and Merritt went back to his walking, and neither of them would remember the other by dinner time. The houses on Cedar Lane looked smaller than he remembered. Some had new siding and new fences. A couple had been torn down and rebuilt with a modern style that didn't match the neighborhood. The old oak tree at the corner of 4th and Cedar was still standing, its branches wider now, reaching across the road like arms trying to hold something together. A mailbox at the corner had a name he didn't recognize, painted on the side in white letters. The Pattersons used to live there, an older couple who hosted a block party every 4th of July and made potato salad that Opal said was too heavy on the mustard. Merritt wondered where they'd gone. Moved, died. Forgotten by the street the same way the street had forgotten him. 20 years was long enough for an entire neighborhood to turn over, for families to arrive and depart and leave nothing behind except a paint color on the siding and a set of numbers on the mailbox. He turned the corner onto Cedar Lane proper, and his feet slowed without him telling them to. His body knew this street better than his mind did. His legs had walked this pavement 10,000 times from the corner to his front door, carrying groceries, carrying lumber, carrying 4-year-old Artis on his shoulders while she gripped his hair with both fists and laughed at the height of it. The world looking different from up there, bigger, brighter, full of things she could see that he couldn't. Merritt stopped walking. His house was halfway down the block. A single-story bungalow with a covered porch and a detached workshop in the back. He'd bought it when Twyla was 6 years old and spent the first summer rebuilding the porch and adding the workshop. Every beam, every nail, his own hands. Opal had planted rose bushes along the front walk the day they moved in, kneeling in the dirt in her gardening gloves, while Twyla ran circles around the yard and Merritt carried boxes through the front door. The rose bushes were still there. Merritt stared at them. Small blooms, deep crimson, the same variety Opal had picked from a nursery catalog 3 decades ago. Rose bushes don't survive 20 years on their own. Someone had been pruning them, watering the bed, cutting back the dead growth each fall. Someone had been taking care of Opal's roses. He walked closer. The porch had been repainted, white with gray trim, the same colors he'd chosen originally. The roof looked newer, the windows were clean, and behind the front window, warm and unmistakable, a light was on. Merritt's heart beat hard enough to feel in his throat. This was supposed to be an empty house, abandoned, foreclosed, sold to strangers. That was what he told himself for 20 years, because the alternative, that someone was still here, still waiting, was too much to carry on top of everything else. The front curtain shifted. Someone was inside and they'd seen him. Merritt gripped the brass key in his fist and climbed the porch steps. The boards were solid beneath his feet. Someone had reinforced them, replaced the ones that used to sag under his weight. When he came home from job sites with sawdust in his hair and Opal's dinner waiting on the table, he stood at the front door and listened. A child's voice, high and musical, saying something he couldn't make out. Music from a radio, low and soft, the clink of a mug being set down on a countertop. He raised his hand to knock, then he stopped. This was his house, his door, his key. A man shouldn't have to knock on his own front door, no matter how many years have passed. He turned the key in the lock, and the door opened. The smell reached him first. Coffee, fresh coffee, and something sweet like pancake batter on a hot griddle. Then the warmth, not just temperature, but the warmth of habitation, of breath and movement, and the small accumulations of daily life. The house was breathing. Someone had been cooking breakfast minutes ago. A young woman sat at the kitchen table with a mug in her hands and a book open beside it. She had dark hair pulled back from her face, and when she looked up at Merritt, her eyes sent a jolt through his chest that nearly buckled his knees. He knew those eyes. He had looked into those eyes every morning for 30 years across a kitchen table just like this one. Opal's eyes, dark and steady and direct, the kind of eyes that looked at you and made you feel like you'd been seen all the way to the back wall of your soul. At the woman's feet, a small boy lay on the linoleum floor with a fistful of crayons and a sheet of paper, drawing something with the fierce concentration that only a very young child can bring to a crayon and a blank page. The woman looked at Merritt. She looked at his prison-issue shoes, at the plastic bag in his hand, at the key he was gripping so hard his knuckles had gone white. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for a phone. She set her mug down slowly, carefully, and she studied him. "You must be Merritt." He opened his mouth and nothing came out. He stood in the doorway of his own house holding everything he owned in the world, and his voice wouldn't work. 20 years of concrete and fluorescent light and the slow erosion of everything he used to be, and now he was standing in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and pancakes, and he couldn't produce a single sound. "Come in," the woman said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it, something controlled, like a person who had rehearsed this moment many times and was now discovering that rehearsal and reality were two different things. "Close the door. You're letting the cold in." Merritt stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him. The boy on the floor looked up from his drawing and stared at Merritt with wide brown eyes. No fear, no confusion, just the clear, open curiosity of a 3-year-old meeting someone new. "Who are you?" Merritt managed. His voice came out like sandpaper on rough grain. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words since the guard said goodbye. "My name is Artis," the woman said. She watched his face as she said it, waiting for something to register. "Twyla was my mother." The words came at him one at a time, each one landing with its own weight. "Twyla was my mother." Merritt stared at her. A memory rose slowly like something surfacing from deep water. Opal's letter, one of the early ones. Blue ink on lined paper, Opal's careful slant. She'd written about Twyla having the baby a girl. They named her Artis. "She has your eyes, Merritt." "You're Twyla's daughter," he said. "Yes, you're my granddaughter." Artis nodded. "I am." Merritt looked at her. He looked past the young woman sitting at his kitchen table and tried to find the baby, the toddler, the 4-year-old with the toy hammer who used to sit on the workshop floor and bang on scraps of wood while he worked. He couldn't find her in this grown woman's face. 20 years was too long. But Opal's eyes were there, unmistakable. And Twyla's jawline. And something in the way she held herself straight, backed and steady, that reminded him of his wife. "And who's this?" Merritt asked, looking at the boy. "This is Nolan, my son. He's 3. The boy held up his crayon drawing. "I drew a house." Merritt's throat closed. He looked at the drawing, a rectangle with a triangle roof. A door, 4 windows, a chimney with curling smoke. In front of the house, the boy had drawn 3 stick figures of different sizes. "That's a good house," Merritt whispered. Artis's eyes were on him, reading him the way you read weather coming over a hill. Not warm, not cold, watchful. She had prepared for this moment, Merritt realized. She had been waiting for him. But waiting and welcoming were 2 different things, and Artis was still deciding which one this was going to be. "How did you know I was coming?" Merritt asked. "Mom told me you would. Mom was always right about you." The way she said it was flat, neutral with intention, the kind of neutral that comes from holding a great deal behind a carefully maintained wall and not yet deciding how much to let through. Merritt looked past Artis at the wall behind her. A photograph hung there in a wooden frame he recognized because he'd built it himself 30 years ago for his and Opal's anniversary. But the picture inside was one he'd never seen. Twyla, older than the daughter he carried in his memory, gray at her temples and fine lines around her eyes, sitting on the front porch of this house. A girl of about 6 or 7 sat on her lap, arms thrown around Twyla's neck, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. The kitchen behind them in the photograph was this kitchen. The same pale yellow cabinets, the same window over the sink, the same curtain rod Merritt had installed with his own hands 3 decades ago. His daughter had lived here, in his house, at his table, among his things, and he had not known. Artis followed his gaze to the photograph. She let him look. She didn't explain. She let the picture do the work that pictures do, which is to show you everything you missed while you were somewhere else, convinced that the people you left behind had stopped existing. "There's a lot you don't know, Grandpa," Artis said quietly. She pushed the mug of coffee across the table toward him. "About Grandma, about my mom, about what happened while you were gone." She paused. Her eyes, Opal's eyes, held his. Drink that first. Then I'll tell you everything. Merritt drank the coffee. It was strong brewed dark with a bitterness that sat on the back of his tongue and reminded him of mornings he hadn't lived in 20 years. Artis sat across from him and waited. She didn't rush. She held her own mug with both hands and watched him the way a person watches a wound they're about to clean, knowing it will hurt, knowing it has to be done. Nolan had gone back to his drawing on the floor. The scratch of crayon on paper was the only sound in the kitchen, besides the low murmur of the radio and the hum of the refrigerator. Merritt looked at the table beneath his hands. Solid oak with dovetailed corners and a scratch near the edge, where someone had dragged something sharp across the grain years ago. He knew this table. He had built this table during their first year in the house. He could still feel the ghost of the hand plane in his palm, the long, smooth strokes that brought the surface to a shine. "Where do you want me to start?" Artis asked. "The beginning, after I went in." "Okay." She took a breath. Mom was angry, really angry. For the first couple of years, she wouldn't say your name. She told people her father was dead. Merritt flinched, but he held Artis's gaze. He owed her that much. "She blamed you," Artis said, "for what happened to the family. The neighbors stopped coming by. Grandma Opal couldn't walk to the grocery store without people whispering behind the cereal aisle. Mom's friends from church stopped calling. The women she used to have coffee with on Tuesday mornings suddenly had other plans. Every Tuesday, for 2 years, it was like you'd pulled everyone down with you when you fell." "I did," Merritt said. "Maybe, but it wasn't your fault," the way she made it sound. "She was scared, Grandpa. Her father was in prison, her mother was falling apart, and she had a baby. Me. She didn't know how to be angry and terrified at the same time, so she picked angry because angry was something she could hold on to." Merritt looked down at his hands on the table. They were the hands of a 72-year-old man who hadn't held a tool in 2 decades. Thick knuckles, stiff joints, the skin thin enough to see the blue veins running underneath. He curled his fingers into his palms. "What happened to Opal?" he asked. After the letter stopped, Artis set her mug down. She placed both palms flat on the table, fingers spread pressing down as if steadying herself against something that was about to move beneath her. "3 years after you went in," Artis said, "Grandma Opal had a stroke." Merritt went still. "A bad one. She was alone in the kitchen when it happened. The neighbor across the street, Mr. Presley, heard something crash through his window. He found her on the floor, conscious but unable to move her right side. He called 911 and stayed with her until the ambulance came." Merritt's mouth opened, then closed. He stared at Artis and felt the kitchen tilt slightly as if the floor had shifted an inch to the left. "She lost the use of her right hand," Artis said, "completely. And she lost her speech. The doctors called it expressive aphasia. She could understand everything people said to her, every word, every sentence. Her mind was perfectly clear, but the connection between her thoughts and her mouth was severed. She knew what she wanted to say. She could see the words in her head, but when she tried to speak, nothing came out the way it was supposed to. Sounds without shape, syllables that collapsed before they became language. She couldn't write," Merritt said. His voice was barely there. "No, she couldn't write. She couldn't hold a pen with her right hand at all, and her left hand had never been strong enough to do more than hold a coffee cup." Artis's voice was steady, practiced almost as if she had told this story before, or at least rehearsed it in her head enough times that the words came out in order without breaking. But her eyes were wet. "That's why the letter stopped Grandpa. She didn't choose to stop. She didn't give up on you. Her body gave up on her." Merritt pressed his fist against his mouth and closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he could see Opal's handwriting, the blue ink, the careful slant, the way she always signed off the same way. "Still yours, O." He had spent 17 years believing she had chosen silence, that she had weighed the cost of loving him from the other side of a wall and decided it was too much, that she had put down her pen and walked away. She'd been lying on a kitchen floor unable to call for help, and he had been 200 miles north lying on a bunk believing she'd stopped loving him. Who took care of her? Merritt asked. Mom did. Artist said it simply because it was simple. Mom dropped everything. She'd been working at the elementary school teaching second grade. She quit the week after the stroke, moved in with Grandma Opal, and took care of her full time. 5 years. Twyla did that. She did. Whatever you're thinking about Mom being angry at you, she showed up for Grandma Opal every single day. She bathed her, fed her, read to her out loud for hours because Grandma could still understand everything even though she couldn't answer. She sat with her when the aphasia made her cry because the words were right there, right behind her teeth, and they wouldn't come out. Merritt swallowed hard. His daughter. The one he'd imagined hating him for 20 years, writing him off, telling the world he was dead. She had spent 5 years nursing her mother through the worst kind of imprisonment Merritt could imagine, a prison inside your own skull, locked in with everything you want to say and no way to say it. And Merritt had been sitting in a cell feeling sorry for himself. And you, he asked, where were you during all this? I was there. Artist smiled faintly. I grew up on the rug in Grandma Opal's living room. Mom would set me up with toys while she worked with Grandma on her exercises. I learned to walk in that house, took my first steps between the coffee table and Grandma's wheelchair. She paused, something shifted in her face. Grandma couldn't talk to me, but she could hold my hand. 1 squeeze meant yes, 2 squeezes meant no, 3 squeezes meant I love you. That was our language. I didn't know until I was older that most grandmothers used words. Merritt's eyes burned. She knew about you, Artist added quietly. She thought about you all the time. Mom told me that on Grandma's clear days, she'd point at the wall where your photo hung and make this sound, this low hum, like she was trying to push your name through a door that wouldn't open. Merritt stood up. He couldn't sit any longer. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, not at the workshop, but at the garden. Opal's garden. He could see raised beds with dark soil and the bare stems of something that had been growing before the cold weather came. The beds were neat-edged with stones, covered in mulch for winter. Someone had been tending them with the same care Opal brought to everything she put her hands in. And then Artist said something that broke through every wall Merritt had left. Every night, Mom would sit at Grandma's bedside and open the bottle on her dresser. White shoulders. She'd dab a little behind Grandma's ears before she went to sleep. Every night, even when Grandma couldn't say why it mattered. Merritt gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. His back was to Artist. He couldn't turn around. He couldn't let his granddaughter see his face right now because whatever was on it belonged to him and Opal and no one else. I asked Mom once why she did it, Artist continued. Mom said Grandma always wore it at night because he was waiting for someone to come home, and she was still waiting. The kitchen was quiet. Nolan's crayon scratched softly on the floor. The radio played a song Merritt didn't recognize. He stood at the window with his hands on the counter and breathed until his chest stopped shaking. Then Artist stood up and opened a cabinet above the refrigerator. She brought down a small wooden box with a brass latch and set it on the table. Mom found this in Grandma's nightstand after she died, Artist said. She kept it for you. She opened the box. Inside were sheets of paper. Dozens of them, some lined, some torn from notebooks, some the backs of envelopes. On each one in handwriting Merritt did not recognize were marks, shaky, crooked, sometimes barely legible. Letters that wobbled and overlapped and trailed off the edge of the paper as if the hand holding the pen had been fighting just to stay on course. Merritt. That was on the first sheet. just his name. Written over and over, the letters lurching across the page like a child's first attempts at language. But this wasn't now a child's writing. This was the writing of a woman whose right hand no longer worked, whose left hand had never been trained to hold a pen, who had spent God knows how many hours sitting in bed or at a table gripping a ballpoint in her weak hand, forcing it across paper through sheer will and love, and the refusal to let silence be the last word. ILOVE on one sheet. The letters so unsteady they were barely readable. MISSYOU on another, COMEIOME on a third. None of them had been mailed. Opal couldn't get them into envelopes, couldn't write an address, couldn't walk to the mailbox. She had written them and put them in this box, and the box had sat in her nightstand drawer for years, holding the weight of everything she wanted to say to a man who thought she'd forgotten him. Merritt spread the sheets across the table, one by one, his wife's love reduced to trembling marks on paper. 17 years of silence, and she'd been trying to speak the entire time. Every shaking letter was a battle she'd fought with her own broken body reaching across the miles and the silence and the locked doors to the man she loved. He couldn't hold it anymore. The thing he'd kept sealed for 20 years cracked open inside his chest like ice breaking on a river in spring, sudden and loud and impossible to stop. Merritt put his head in his hands and cried, not quietly, not the way a man cries when he's embarrassed about it. He cried the way a man cries when the grief has been compressed for so long that when it finally finds an opening, it comes out with the force of something geological. Artist picked up Nolan and carried him into the living room. She closed the kitchen door. She gave Merritt the room. He cried for Opal, for the letters she'd tried to write with a hand that wouldn't cooperate, for the morning she collapsed on the kitchen floor while he was 200 miles away, convinced she'd stopped loving him. He cried for the decision he'd made in that administrative office, telling them to cut the mail, severing the last thread. And he cried for himself for the 17 years he'd spent in silence, not because silence had been forced on him, but because he'd chosen it. When it was done, he gathered Opal's letters one by one and placed them carefully back in the box. He closed the brass latch. He wiped his face with the heel of his hand and walked into the living room. Artist was on the couch with Nolan reading him a picture book. She looked up when Merritt came in. "I'm sorry," Merritt said. "Don't be. There's no wrong way to find this out." Merritt sat down. His legs felt uncertain beneath him. Artist reached under the coffee table and pulled out a leather notebook worn at the edges, held shut with an old rubber band. But before she opened it, she said, "There's something else I want to show you first." She led him down the hallway to the master bedroom. The door was closed. Merritt put his hand on the knob and hesitated. "It's okay," Artist said. "Go ahead." He opened the door. The bed was made. His old dresser stood against the wall. Opal's reading lamp was still on the nightstand, the one with the green glass shade he'd bought at an estate sale the year they got married. The room smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap. "Nobody uses this room," Artist said. "Mom slept in the second bedroom. I sleep in what used to be the sewing room. We kept this one the way it was." Merritt stepped inside. He touched the dresser, the lamp. Then he saw it, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed. He picked it up, and the weight of it surprised him. It was lighter than he expected, the fabric soft from years of washing. He could see the patterns: blue plaid, chambray, work shirt flannel. His shirts, his old blue work shirts, the ones he used to wear to job sites, the chambray he wore on Sundays. Opal had cut them into squares and stitched them together into a quilt so she could wrap herself in something that felt like him. "She made that the year after you left," Artist said softly from the doorway. "Mom told me Grandma Opal worked on it for months, cutting the fabric with her right hand, stitching at the kitchen table late at night. Mom said it was the only time she saw Grandma cry during those first 2 years. Merritt held the quilt against his chest. He could feel the seams under his fingers, the careful stitching, the places where the fabric had been folded and refolded so many times that the cotton had worn thin. His wife had made a blanket from his old clothes because she couldn't hold him, and this was as close as she could get. He set the quilt down carefully and turned away. Grandma died 12 years ago, Artis said. In her sleep, Mom was with her. She went peaceful. She wasn't in pain. Merritt nodded. He walked out of the bedroom and closed the door behind him. He didn't trust himself to speak. Back in the living room, Artis pulled out the leather notebook again. Mom's journal, she said. She started it the year after you went in, wrote in it almost every week for 15 years. She set it on the table between them. She told me to give it to you. She said you needed to understand what happened on her side of the wall. Merritt reached for the journal. The leather was soft from handling. He slid off the rubber band and opened to the first page. Twila's journal didn't start with anger. It started with fear. The first entry was dated 2 weeks after his sentencing. The handwriting was tight, controlled, the writing of someone holding herself together by force of will. She wrote about the house feeling wrong without him, about Opal not eating, about Artis crying every night, about expecting to hear the workshop saw running in the morning and the silence that folded something inside her when it didn't come. Then the tone shifted. 6 months in Twyla wrote about her anger. She understood what Merritt had done and why. She knew he'd been trying to help that woman in the parking lot. But understanding didn't stop the pain. The right thing had cost her a father. It was costing her mother her mind, and she didn't know how to forgive that. Merritt read that entry twice. He'd imagined Twyla's anger as simple a daughter who decided her father was a criminal and walked away. But this was the anger of someone who understood exactly why he'd done what he'd done and was furious anyway, because understanding and acceptance are not the same thing. Then he turned to the entry that changed everything. 3 years in, the week after Opal's stroke, Twila's handwriting had gone jagged, the letters pressed hard enough to dent the paper. She'd tried to call the prison. They told her Merritt had refused all family contact. She didn't understand. She thought he'd want to know about his wife. She wrote him a letter, told him everything. The stroke, the aphasia, the prognosis. She mailed it to the prison. It came back 2 weeks later, stamped with a single word in red ink. Refused. Merritt stared at the word on the page. The form he'd signed in the administrative office. The form that was supposed to stop Opal's letters from reaching him. It hadn't just blocked Opal. It had blocked everything. Every letter from anyone with his last name. The prison had returned his daughter's letter about his wife's stroke, and he had never known it existed. Twyla sent 3 more letters over the next year. All came back the same way. Refused. Repeat. Refuse. 4 letters about his wife's medical crisis, each one stamped and returned like junk mail. Merritt's hands tightened on the journal until the leather creased. Then came the visits. Twyla had driven to the prison. 6 hours each way through the flat farmland of central Ohio, past the same gas stations and billboard advertisements and rest stops. She'd called ahead. When she arrived, they told her the inmate had refused all visitors. She sat in the parking lot for 2 hours before she drove home. She went back after Opal died. Same result. Turned away at the desk. She went a 3rd time after the diagnosis, cancer. She was already in treatment, already thinner than she should have been, already fighting a war inside her own body. She brought Artis with her. Artis was 20 years old. They made it as far as the waiting room. The prison paged Merritt over the intercom. Merritt remembered those pages. He remembered hearing his name crackle over the speaker system 2 or 3 times over the years. Each time he'd shaken his head and stayed on his bunk. He hadn't asked who was there. He'd told the prison years ago that he had no family, and after that it never occurred to him that the visitors might be anyone who mattered. He assumed they were lawyers, caseworkers, people with clipboards and questions he didn't want to answer. His daughter had driven 6 hours while dying of cancer, and he had been lying 50 meters from the waiting room, shaking his head. "I was there," Artist said from the couch. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of someone who had kept this particular stone in her pocket for 4 years, waiting for the right moment to set it down. "I sat in that waiting room. I was 20 years old. They paged you 3 times. Mom sat in the plastic chair next to me and didn't move. When the guard came back and said you weren't interested, Mom stood up, put on her coat and said, 'Let's go home.' She didn't cry. She just walked out." Merritt closed the journal. He pressed it against his chest and stared at the ceiling. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know it was her. I didn't know anyone was coming for me." "I know," Artist said. "I thought they were caseworkers. I thought nobody was left." "I know." The room was quiet for a long time. Nolan had fallen asleep on Artist's lap, his small body curled against her with the total trust of a child who has never been given a reason to doubt the arms holding him. Merritt opened the journal again. He read forward through the years. Twyla's anger had changed. It wasn't hot anymore. It was cold and tired and full of a sadness that had settled into the words themselves. She wrote about not understanding why he wouldn't let them in, about Opal pointing at his photograph on the wall, about wondering whether he hated them or was protecting them or simply couldn't face what he'd left behind. That last possibility Merritt knew was the truth. He'd been afraid. Afraid that if he let them in, if he heard Opal's name spoken out loud through a phone receiver, or saw Twyla's face through a glass partition, the grief would swallow him whole and he'd never make it to the other side of his sentence. He told himself he was being strong. He wasn't. He was hiding. After Opal's death, the journal changed again. The entries became less frequent but longer. Twyla wrote about moving into Merritt's house with 8-year-old Artist, about repainting the porch, about walking into the workshop for the first time and standing there breathing in the smell of sawdust and linseed oil and feeling Merritt in the room even though he was 200 miles away. She wrote about learning to maintain his tools. She didn't know a chisel from a gouge, but she bought a book on tool maintenance from the hardware store and spent every Saturday morning in the workshop oiling blades, removing rust, keeping edges sharp. She did it because she believed he was coming home and he would need them when he got there. Merritt looked up from the journal. The workshop was visible through the living room window, its cedar siding weathered but intact, its tin roof catching the afternoon light. Twyla had spent years caring for tools she couldn't use, maintaining a workspace she didn't understand because she never stopped believing her father would walk back through that door. He read about Artist growing up. Twyla recorded everything: first softball game, science fair project, the fight at school when Artist was 12 and decked a boy twice her size for shoving a younger kid into a locker. Twyla had to pick her up from the principal's office and sat in the parking lot afterward, half furious and half proud, writing in her journal that Artist was so much like Merritt it scared her sometimes. The stubbornness, the refusal to back down, the instinct to step in front of someone weaker without counting the cost. Merritt looked at Artist across the living room. She sat with her sleeping son and met his gaze without flinching. She looked exactly the way Twyla had described her: stubborn, direct, unafraid. Then he read the final entries. Twyla had been diagnosed 2 years before Merritt's release. The cancer started in her breast and spread before they caught it. She wrote about treatment, chemotherapy, radiation, 2 surgeries, days when she couldn't stand up, days when her hair came out in handfuls on the pillow, days when Artist drove her to the hospital and sat in the waiting room for hours flipping through magazines she didn't read, while her mother sat in a chair with chemicals dripping into her veins through a tube in her arm. Twyla fought the way she did everything else, directly, practically, without self-pity. She researched her diagnosis. She asked her doctors questions until they ran out of answers. She kept a separate notebook for medical appointments filled with dates and dosages and blood counts, the handwriting getting shakier with each entry but never stopping. And through all of it, she kept writing about Merritt. She called the prison again. Same answer, no family contact. She told them she was dying. She told them her father needed to know. The woman on the phone said there was nothing she could do. She sounded sorry, but sorry doesn't open doors. Twyla wrote about preparing. The house was paid off, property taxes current through the next 5 years. She'd set up what she could for artists. She'd talked to a lawyer. She'd organized everything with the precision of a woman who knew she was running out of time and refused to leave a mess behind. Then near the end, she wrote about Merritt's release date. 2 more years. She wouldn't be here. But artists would. She told artists to stay in the house, keep it ready, keep the workshop clean, keep the garden watered, keep the porch light on. When he walks through that door, Twyla wrote, I want him to find a home, not an empty building. Merritt closed the journal and looked at artists. You didn't lose us, Grandpa, she said quietly. We were right here the whole time. Merritt set the journal on the coffee table. He sat in the silence of the living room and felt the full weight of what he'd done. Not the punch in the parking lot, not the 20 years behind walls. Those he'd paid for. The real debt was the form he'd signed, the door he'd locked from the inside, the family that had spent 2 decades trying to reach him while he lay on a bunk telling himself nobody cared. Are you angry at me? He asked. Artis was quiet for a long time. She looked down at Nolan sleeping in her arms, then back at Merritt. I grew up in this house, she said. I walked past your workshop every morning on my way to school. I saw your photograph on the wall every day of my life. Mom told me you were the best man she ever knew. And at the same time, I knew you signed a form that sent our letters back. I knew Mom drove 6 hours and got turned away. I sat in that waiting room and watched her walk out without you. She paused. Her voice didn't waver, but there was pressure behind it, the pressure of years. I'm angry, but Mom explained it to me. You were afraid. You were ashamed. You thought we'd be better off without you dragging us down. You were wrong, but I understand why you thought it. Then she said the thing that cut deepest, not with cruelty, but with honesty. What I don't know yet is whether I can forgive you. Mom forgave you. Grandma forgave you a long time ago. Me, I'm not there yet. I need time. Merritt nodded. You have all the time in the world. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet. But the agreement that forgiveness was on the table, that it was possible that the door was open even if neither of them was ready to walk through it. Artis reached under the coffee table and pulled out a white envelope. One word on the front in Twyla's handwriting. Dad. Mom wrote this the week before she died, Artis said. She told me to give it to you when you came home. She was very specific about that. When, not if. She placed the envelope on the table. Merritt didn't open it. Not yet. His hands were trembling, and some things deserve stillness. He picked it up and held it in both hands and looked at his daughter's handwriting on the front. The same handwriting he recognized from every report card she'd ever brought home, every grocery list on the fridge, every Christmas card she'd ever signed. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, Artis agreed. He read it before dawn. The house was dark. Nolan was asleep down the hall. Artis's room was quiet. Merritt sat on the couch in the living room with the envelope in his lap and the first gray light of morning showing through the curtains. He slid his finger under the flap and pulled out 2 sheets of heavy stationery. The handwriting was weaker than the journal entries, smaller, more careful, written by someone conserving what little energy she had left for the one thing she still needed to say. Twyla wrote that she'd been angry at him for years, angry about the punch, the prison, being left behind. And when he refused her letters and her visits, she was angry about that too. But somewhere around year 10, the anger burned itself out. What was left underneath surprised her. She understood him. She understood why he'd stepped in that night outside the bar. He saw someone in trouble and he couldn't stand still. That's who he was. That's who he'd always been. And she understood why he'd locked the door in prison too. He was ashamed. He couldn't stomach the idea of his family seeing him behind glass wearing a number with guards watching every word. He thought he was protecting them. He wasn't. He was protecting himself. And then Twyla wrote the line that went through Merritt like a nail through pine. She said she'd inherited that same pride from him. She was too angry to write in the first year, too proud to admit she needed her father. By the time she tried to reach him, he'd already sealed the door. They were the same, she and Merritt. Stubborn people who would rather suffer alone than ask for help. She forgave him for not letting her in. She asked him please to let Artis in. She wrote about Artis being so much like him, it took her breath away sometimes. Strong and stubborn and kind, the kind of person who stands up for people even when it costs her. She wrote about Nolan being the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, and the fact that Merritt hadn't met him yet being the biggest regret of her life. She would not be there when he came home. She'd accepted that. But Artis would be there. Artis had promised. The house, the workshop, the garden, the porch light, Artis would keep it all. The letter ended with this: "Come home. Let Artis cook you breakfast. Let Nolan show you his drawings. Go to the workshop and pick up your tools. Build something. Build something beautiful the way you always did. And be kind to yourself. You made a mistake. You made a lot of mistakes. So did I. That's what people do. What matters is what you do with the time you have left." Merritt read the letter twice. Then he folded it along the same creases and slid it back into the envelope. He sat in the dark living room and felt something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. It wasn't Twyla's forgiveness. He'd read that. He believed her. It was something harder. The first fracture in the wall he'd built around his own guilt. The beginning, small and uncertain and fragile, of forgiving himself. He stood up and walked to the kitchen. He filled the coffee pot with water and measured the grounds. He set 2 mugs on the counter. By the time Artis came into the kitchen with Nolan on her hip, the coffee was ready and Merritt was sitting at the table. "You're up early," Artis said. "Old habit." She looked at the coffee, at the 2 mugs, at the empty envelope on the table. She didn't ask about the letter. She poured herself a cup and sat down across from him. Nolan wiggled down from her hip and climbed onto the chair next to Merritt. He looked at Merritt's mug with interest. "Can I have some?" "You're 3, Artis said. Almost 4. Still no." Nolan accepted this verdict and reached for a banana from the bowl on the table. Merritt peeled it for him without thinking. His hands remembered how to do things like this. Small automatic gestures from a life he thought was gone. Muscle memory from a world that had kept going without him, that had held its shape and its rituals in its Tuesday morning banana, waiting for him to step back into it as if he'd only been gone for an afternoon. The first week, Merritt fixed what was broken. He didn't announce it or ask permission. He simply saw things that needed repair and repaired them the way a man breathes without deciding to breathe. A cabinet hinge under the kitchen sink had pulled loose from the frame, leaving the door hanging at an angle that caught your knee when you walked past. Merritt found a screwdriver in the junk drawer and tightened it. The door hung straight. Artis noticed but said nothing. The bathroom faucet had been dripping long enough to leave a rust stain in the porcelain. Merritt took it apart on the counter, replaced the washer with one he found in a jar of spare parts on the workshop shelf, and put it back together. The dripping stopped. The second step on the front porch had split along the grain, a crack wide enough to catch a heel. Merritt went to the workshop, pulled the canvas cover off the table saw, and stood there for a moment with his hand on the machine. The cord was coiled neatly on top. The blade guard was clean. The fence was set square. Twyla had maintained this saw for years without ever turning it on. She kept it ready for him. He selected a piece of oak from the wood rack, measured the step, and cut the replacement on the first try. The saw started clean. The blade bit into the wood with a sound Merritt felt in his sternum, a sound so familiar and so long absent that it momentarily stopped his breath. He fitted the new step, drove the nails, and ran his hand across the surface. Smooth, solid, right. Nolan appeared at the workshop door that afternoon, pajamas, bare feet on the cold concrete floor, toy hammer in one hand and a piece of toast in the other. He climbed onto an overturned bucket and watched Merritt sweep sawdust from the bench with the gravity of a surgeon observing an operation. "What are you making?" "I fixed the porch step. Can I fix something?" Merritt looked at the boy. 3 years old, brown eyes, toast crumbs on his chin. He pulled a scrap of pine from the off-cut bin and set it on the bench. Then he took a piece of fine grit sandpaper from the drawer and placed it in Nolan's free hand. "Along the grain," Merritt said. "Same direction the lines go, like petting a cat." Nolan set down his toast and sanded with serious concentration, his small fingers pressing the paper against the wood, pushing it back and forth with the kind of focused intensity that has no use for conversation. Merritt worked beside him, sharpening a chisel on the whetstone, finding the angle by feel. They worked in silence. Merritt discovered that Nolan didn't need constant talk. The boy was content to be near someone to watch and imitate and occasionally ask a question. It reminded Merritt of something he hadn't thought about in decades, working alongside his own father. In the garage on Saturday mornings, the two of them sanding a cabinet door without exchanging a word, connected by the rhythm of shared work. He built Nolan a stool that week, a simple step stool with the boy's name carved into the top in block letters. Nolan claimed it immediately and dragged it to every room Merritt entered, positioning himself at elbow height and watching everything with the unblinking attention of an apprentice who takes his apprenticeship very seriously. The next project was bigger. Merritt spent 2 weeks on it, working after Nolan went to sleep, choosing each board carefully from the walnut stock in the wood rack. A toy chest, dovetailed corners, a flat lid with soft, close hinges, so small fingers wouldn't get pinched. On the front panel, he carved a row of animals: a dog, a cat, a bear, a rabbit, a bird. Each one took a full evening as gouges biting into the walnut, shaping curves and details from memory. He rubbed the whole thing with tung oil until the wood glowed like something that had been alive once and remembered how warmth felt. Nolan opened it on a Thursday morning, standing in his pajamas in the kitchen, while artist recorded on her phone. The boy ran his fingers over each carved animal and asked what they were. Then he loaded every crayon and every drawing he owned into the chest, closed the lid carefully with both hands, and announced, "This is the best box in the world." Merritt looked at Ardis over the boy's head and saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. It was the first time she'd let him see her cry since the night in the kitchen, and this time the tears were a different kind entirely. By the end of the second week, Merritt knew he had a problem. He'd been fixing things for neighbors, small jobs, a few hours each. Theron Presley's porch railing, a wobbly dining table for a woman 3 doors down, shelves for a man on the next block. Each job paid cash, which Merritt folded into an envelope in his dresser drawer. But cash wasn't documentation. Cash wouldn't satisfy Bernadine Kincaid. The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a text message from Bernadine's office. Reminder: 10 days remaining. Employment verification required. That evening, a truck pulled into the driveway. Old Ford rust around the wheel wells, a toolbox bolted to the bed. The man who climbed out was about 68, lean and weathered, with tattoos running the length of both forearms and gray threaded through black hair that needed cutting. He walked up the porch steps with the ease of someone who'd been here before. "Merritt," he said. "Garnett Ashford." Merritt hadn't seen him in 5 years, not since Garnett finished his sentence and walked out through the same gate Merritt had walked through 3 weeks ago. They'd spent 4 years on the same block. Garnett had been in for armed robbery, a convenience store job that went wrong when he was 30. He'd served 12 years and come out the other side quieter than he went in. "Garnett." They shook hands on the porch. Garnett's grip was calloused and strong. He looked at Merritt at the house at the repaired porch step. "Artis called me," Garnett said. "She told me about the employment situation." Merritt stiffened. "I didn't ask her to do that." "No, you didn't, because you'd rather violate parole than ask another human being for help. I remember that about you." Garnett sat down on the porch rail and pulled a business card from his shirt pocket. "Ashford Plumbing and Home Repair, licensed, bonded, insured," his name in blue ink above a phone number. "I started this 3 years ago," Garnett said. "Got my contractor's license, bought the truck, hired 2 guys. I need a finished carpenter. Someone who can hang cabinets and build shelves and do trim work that doesn't look like it was done by a man wearing mittens." He held out the card. $12 an hour above minimum. W-2. Withholding. The whole deal. You give this to your parole officer and she stops counting. Merritt looked at the card but didn't take it. The old reflex was there. The one that said accepting help was admitting weakness, that needing someone meant you'd failed at the fundamental task of standing on your own 2 feet. Garnett read it on his face. "Merritt, this isn't charity. I've seen your dovetails. I've seen the table in that kitchen. You're the best woodworker I've ever met, and I'm offering you a job because I need you, not because I feel sorry for you. Stop being proud and start being employed." Merritt took the card. He brought the signed employment contract to Bernadine's office on day 27. She reviewed it without expression, checked the business license number against her computer, and placed the document in his file. "This checks out," she said. She closed the folder. "Same time next month, Mr. Caulfield." Merritt nodded and stood to leave. At the door, Bernadine spoke without looking up from her desk. "Mr. Caulfield, your employer, Mr. Ashford, he has a record." "I know. Your parole conditions prohibit association with convicted felons." Merritt turned around. "He's my employer. It's a legitimate business. He's been out for 5 years with no violations." Bernadine looked at him over her glasses. Something moved behind her eyes, not sympathy exactly, but the recognition that the system she served was designed with rules that didn't always account for the complicated geometry of real life. "I'm noting it in the file," she said. "I'm not flagging it yet. Don't give me a reason to." Merritt walked out into the parking lot and stood in the sun for a moment. The system had bent just slightly, just enough to let him through. He'd take it. That Saturday, Garnett picked him up at 7 and they drove to a job site in the next town. A kitchen remodel. Merritt spent the day measuring, cutting, and installing crown molding with a precision that made Garnett's other 2 workers stop and watch. His hands were slower than they'd been at 52. His shoulders ached by noon and his knees by 3. But the knowledge was there, stored in tendons and joints, waiting for permission to come back. By the end of the day, he'd finished the molding and started on the cabinet faces, and Garnett handed him an envelope with cash for the day, plus the promise of a check on Friday. "Same thing you always were," Garnett said, watching Merritt clean his tools at the end of the day. "Too stubborn to do anything less than perfect." "That's not stubbornness," Merritt said. "That's respect for the wood." Garnett grinned. It was the first time Merritt had said something that sounded like the man he used to be. The trouble with Corbin Whitaker started on a Tuesday. Merritt was carrying lumber from Garnett's truck to Theron Presley's garage when a man he didn't recognize crossed the street and stood on the sidewalk watching him. About 40, clean-shaven polo shirt, khaki shorts, the uniform of a man who works from home and mows his lawn on a schedule. He had the look of someone who'd been building up to something for days. Mr. Caulfield, Merritt set the lumber down. I'm Corbin Whitaker. I live at number 31. I've got two kids, 7 and 5, and they play on this street every afternoon. Merritt knew what was coming. He'd seen this moment play out in his mind 100 times during the years inside. The neighbor who finds out. The conversation that follows. I looked up the public record, Corbin said. His voice was controlled but tight. I know what you were convicted of. I think I have a right to know when someone with a violent felony moves onto my block. Merritt met the man's eyes. He saw fear there, real fear, the fear of a father who pictures his children playing 30 yards from a man who killed someone with his fists. Merritt understood that fear. He would have felt the same fear 20 years ago if the positions had been reversed. You're right, Merritt said. You do have a right to know. 20 years ago, I hit a man and he died. I served my full sentence. I'm not dangerous, but I don't expect you to take my word for that. You'll have to decide for yourself. Corbin stared at him. He'd clearly expected an argument, a denial, something he could push back against. Merritt's calm honesty left him with nothing to grip. I'm watching, Corbin said finally. I'd expect nothing less. Corbin walked back to his house. From that day forward, whenever Merritt passed number 31, Corbin was on the porch, standing, arms crossed, watching, never speaking, never threatening, just present, a man standing guard over his family's perimeter. Merritt didn't resent it. He would have done the same thing. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, Merritt was walking home from the cemetery when he heard a child crying on Corbin Whitaker's porch. Corbin's daughter, the 7-year-old, was sitting on the tump step holding her knee. A porch board had rotted through, and the leg of her chair had punched through the soft wood, tipping her forward. Her knee was scraped and bleeding. Corbin was on his knees next to her, examining the damage to both his daughter and his porch, clearly equipped to handle neither. Merritt didn't hesitate. He walked to his workshop, selected a piece of oak. He'd already planed smooth, grabbed his hand, saw a hammer and a pocket of nails, and crossed the street. He knelt beside the broken board without asking permission, measured the gap with his eye, cut the replacement on Corbin's front lawn, and nailed it into place. 15 minutes. The board sat flush and tight, a clean patch of pale oak against the weathered gray of the old porch. Corbin's daughter had stopped crying. She watched Merritt work with her injured knee forgotten. Are you a carpenter? She asked. I am. You're really good. Merritt stood up and brushed the sawdust from his knees. He looked at Corbin. Corbin looked at the new board, then at his daughter, then at Merritt. Something shifted in his face. Not trust, not yet, but the first crack in the wall of certainty he'd built around the idea that the man across the street was someone to fear. Thank you, Corbin said. The rest of these boards need replacing before winter, Merritt said. They're soft all the way through. I can do it if you want. Corbin was quiet for a long moment. His daughter tugged his hand. Can he, Daddy? He's really good. Let me think about it, Corbin said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. And sometimes the distance between those two words is where redemption begins. Merritt started visiting the cemetery once a week. He went on Sunday afternoons when the light came through the trees at a low angle and the grounds were empty. He stood between Opal Stone and Twyla Stone, and he talked. He told them about Nolan learning to use the block plane, about Artis's anatomy textbook spread across the kitchen table at midnight, about the shelves he was building for a woman down the street who had 7 cats, about the garden coming back to life, green shoots pushing through the soil and the raised beds reaching for the spring sun, the way living things do when they've been dormant long enough. He told them he was sorry. He told them he understood now what he'd done. Not the punch. That was a moment. What he'd done was afterward. The form, the locked door, the 17 years of chosen silence while his wife was trying to write his name with a hand that wouldn't cooperate, and his daughter was driving 6 hours to a building that wouldn't let her in. "I'll take care of them," he said, standing between the two stones with his hands at his sides and the spring wind moving through the trees. "Artis and Nolan, I'll be here for them the way I should have been here for you." He touched Opal's stone, ran his fingers across the carved letters of her name. "Still yours," he whispered, "always." The box of recipe cards changed everything between Merritt and Artis. He found it on a Tuesday evening, rummaging through the kitchen junk drawers for a roll of tape. A tin box dented at one corner with a faded picture of a cardinal on the lid. Inside, a stack of index cards in Opal's handwriting, her chili recipe, her cornbread, her tomato sauce, the one she made every September from the garden harvest. Each card had notes in the margins. Merritt likes extra pepper. Twyla won't eat onions. Add sugar for little Artis. Merritt stood in the kitchen holding the cards and felt Opal closer than he had at any moment since walking through the front door. Because this wasn't memory and it wasn't grief. This was her hand, still on the page, still guiding him, still knowing how he liked his food, still accounting for him in the margins of a recipe she'd written 30 years ago. He cooked the chili that evening. He followed the card exactly, measuring the cumin and the chili powder and the kidney beans the way Opal had written them, adding the extra pepper she'd noted for him. The kitchen filled with a smell that belonged to a different decade, warm and earthy and specific in the way that only a family recipe can be. Artis came in from studying and stopped in the doorway. Her face did something Merritt hadn't seen before. The careful neutrality she'd maintained since his arrival slipped, and underneath it was something unguarded and young and startled. "That smell," she said. "Grandma Opal, Mom used to make it exactly like that." She sat down at the table and Merritt served her a bowl, and they ate together without talking. Chili filling the kitchen with a scent that carried more information than any conversation could. It was the smell of a family that had existed before everything went wrong, and here it was again, rising from a pot on the stove, as if the years in between had been nothing more than a long winter between growing seasons. Artis looked up from her bowl and smiled, not the polite, measured smile she'd been offering since Merritt arrived. A real one, the kind that happens before you can decide whether to allow it. That was the night the door between them opened. Not all the way, but enough. The night Artis broke was 2 weeks later. Merritt was reading in the living room after midnight when he heard crying from the kitchen. Quiet crying, the kind a person does when they're trying not to be heard. He found her at the table, textbooks. Open highlighter uncapped her face in her hands. She wasn't crying over anatomy. She was crying the way a person cries when the weight they've been carrying finally exceeds what their body can hold. Merritt sat down across from her. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for her hand or offer comfort or tell her it would be okay. He just sat. Artis lifted her head. Her eyes were red and swollen and exhausted. "You know what the hardest part is," she said. "It's not waiting for you. The hardest part was keeping everything standing so that when you got here, you'd see a home instead of a ruin. Mom told me to do that. Keep it together for your grandfather. I was 22. I didn't know how to keep things together for myself. But I kept it together for you, because Mom asked." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "And now you're here, and the waiting part is over, and I don't know what comes next because I spent every ounce of everything I had on the waiting, and now that it's done, I'm just empty." Merritt looked at his granddaughter, 24 years old, working the breakfast shift at a diner 5 days a week, coming home to a 3-year-old, studying at night for nursing school entrance exams, holding a house together, holding a promise together, holding herself together with nothing but stubbornness in the memory of a mother who'd asked her to be strong. "You've done enough," Merritt said. "The rest is mine." Artis looked at him for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked on the wall. The refrigerator hummed. Nolan's breathing drifted down the hall, slow and steady as a tide. Then she nodded, a single sharp nod that reminded Merritt so precisely of Twyla that his chest ached. "Okay," she said. It was the most important word anyone had said to Merritt Caulfield in 20 years. The afternoon Merritt met Whitman Tolliver, the spring had fully arrived. The trees along Cedar Lane had filled out with new leaves, and Opal's rose bushes were blooming again, red and full along the front walk. Merritt was walking home from the hardware store with a bag of sandpaper when he saw a young man standing on the sidewalk a block from the house. About 30, thin, wearing clothes that didn't fit right, and carrying a backpack that looked brand new, the kind the state gives you when they open the gate. He was holding a piece of paper in one hand and looking at the street signs with the expression of someone trying to match a memory to a map that no longer corresponds. Merritt crossed the street. "You lost." The man flinched. "No, I'm looking for an address. My sister's supposed to live around here, but I can't reach her." "What's the street?" "Cedar Lane, number 47. Merritt pointed. 2 blocks east past the stop sign, then left. "Thank you." The man folded the paper and started to walk away, then stopped. "Hey, is there a diner or something around here? Somewhere I could sit for a minute." "There's a diner on Main," Merritt said. "But come on, I've got coffee on and I live right down there." He pointed at his house. "You can sit on the porch and figure out your next move." The young man hesitated. His eyes went to Merritt's hands, his clothes, his face looking for signals, trying to determine if this stranger was safe or just another thing to survive. "I'm Merritt," Merritt said. "I live with my granddaughter and her little boy. I got out 3 months ago myself." "You don't have to explain anything." The tension went out of the man's shoulders. His face changed. The wariness didn't leave entirely, but it made room for something else, relief maybe, or the simple human gratitude of being recognized by someone who knows what you've been through because they've been through it too. "I'm Whitman," he said. "I appreciate it." They sat on the porch with coffee. Merritt told Whitman about the diner where Artis worked, about the hardware store, about the pastor at the Methodist church who was decent and didn't ask too many questions. Small, practical information. The kind of things a man needs on his first day back in a world that kept moving while he was standing still. When Whitman finished his coffee, he stood and shook Merritt's hand. "Thank you," he said, "for the coffee and for not looking at me like I'm dangerous." "You're not dangerous," Merritt said. "You're lost. There's a difference." Whitman nodded once and walked away down the street toward his sister's house. Merritt watched him go and hoped the lights would be on when he got there. Theron Presley came by that same week. 75 years old, stooped and slow, wearing his usual plaid flannel and Seed Company cap. He sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked for an hour. He drank his coffee black and held the mug with both hands, the way men of his generation do, wrapping their fingers around the ceramic as if the warmth itself is the point and the coffee is just an excuse. Theron didn't repeat what Artis had already told Merritt. He didn't retell the stroke or the hospital or the letters. Instead, he told Merritt what he'd seen from across the street, his own side of the story. "I watched your family for 20 years, Theron said. "I'm not proud of the beginning. When you went in, nobody on the street crossed the road to check on Opal. We didn't know what to say. She was alone for months, and we let her be alone. That's on all of us." He told Merritt about Artis after Twyla died. 22 years old, pregnant, alone in this house with a promise and a pile of bills and a workshop full of tools she didn't know how to use. Theron made sure the lawn got mowed, the gutters got cleaned. He drove Artis to her doctor's appointments when she was too pregnant to fit behind the steering wheel of Twyla's old car. The pastor at the Methodist church came by every 2 weeks with a casserole and a prayer that Theron said was always longer than necessary, but never unwelcome. She's a tough young woman, Theron said. She works harder than anyone on this street. She's been holding this place together with both hands for 2 years, and she never once complained. Not to me, not to anyone. He set his coffee down and looked at Merritt directly. Don't thank me, Merritt. Just be here. That's all any of them ever wanted. Your wife, your daughter, your granddaughter. They just wanted you here. Theron put his cap back on and walked across the street to his own house. Merritt stood on the porch and watched him go and understood for the first time fully that the people on this street had formed a net around his family while he was gone. An imperfect net, slow to deploy, full of holes and hesitations, but a net all the same, and it had held. Late that night, after Artis and Nolan were asleep, Merritt sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in the way only a house with sleeping children can be quiet. A weighted silence full of breath and warmth and the particular gravity of small bodies dreaming. He opened Opal's box. He took out the sheet on top, the one with his name written over and over in her trembling left hand. He turned it over. The back was blank. He found a pen in the kitchen drawer. He sat at the table where he'd eaten 10,000 meals with his wife and his daughter, and he wrote on the back of Opal's letter. His handwriting was steadier than hers had been, but not by much. 20 years of disuse had taken their toll. Opal, I'm sorry I didn't read these sooner. I'm sorry I thought you gave up. You never gave up. I was the one who gave up. But I'm home now, and I'm not leaving again. He sat with the pen in his hand for a long time. Then he added one more line. I can smell your perfume in this house. I think it lives in the walls now. I think it will be here longer than either of us. He folded the paper carefully, placed it back in the box, and closed the brass latch. He carried the box to the workshop and set it on the shelf between his chisels and his hand planes in the place where the most important tools belong. 3 months after the prison gates opened, Merritt Caulfield had a life again. Not the life he'd left behind. That one was gone, and he'd made his peace with its going. This was a new one built from the materials at hand, the way a carpenter builds, working with what the wood gives you instead of fighting against the grain. He woke at 5:30 every morning. Coffee workshop, Nolan at the door with his toy hammer and his toast. They worked side by side in the early light, Merritt cutting and joining Nolan, sanding his scrap of pine with the diligence of a boy who believes that what he's doing matters. Each morning, Nolan added another wood shaving to the jar on his dresser. His collection, Artis called it, 40 curls of pine and oak and walnut lined up in a mason jar like evidence of days well spent. Artis passed her anatomy midterm with a 92. She called Merritt from the parking lot at the community college. Crying, happy crying. The kind that comes when you have been carrying a weight for so long that when someone tells you you're strong enough, you don't know what to do with the relief except let it run down your face. You did it, Merritt said into the phone. I did it. She laughed through the tears. I actually did it. Your mother would be proud. Artis was quiet for a moment. So would Grandma. So am I, Merritt said. And he meant it with every board he'd ever planed and every joint he'd ever cut and every silent year he'd wasted when he could have been saying exactly this to the people who needed to hear it. On a Sunday evening in late April, Merritt carried Nolan out to the front porch. The boy had fallen asleep on the couch after dinner, his head on a throw pillow, one arm hanging off the edge, his toy hammer on the floor beneath his open hand. Merritt lifted him, carefully settling the small body against his shoulder. Nolan stirred, but didn't wake. His fingers curled into the fabric of Merritt's shirt and held on. The evening was mild. Spring had come to Cedar Lane in full, the dogwoods blooming white along the fences, the lawns bright green after the rain. Opal's rose bushes swayed gently along the front walk, their red blooms open to the fading light. The oak tree at the corner held its new leaves out over the road, filtering the last of the sun into moving patterns on the asphalt. Merritt sat in the porch chair with Nolan warm against his chest. The boy's heartbeat thumped slow and steady against his own two rhythms, finding each other through cotton and skin and bone. The drawing Nolan had made that first morning was taped to the inside of the front window. The house with the triangle roof and the four stick figures. Three of them grouped together, the fourth taller than the rest standing a little apart. Merritt had placed it on the wall himself next to the photograph of Twyla and Artis on the porch. The man who had been standing apart had come home. Through the window, he could see Artis at the kitchen table, highlighter in hand, textbook, open, a mug of tea cooling beside her elbow. The kitchen light made a warm rectangle on the porch boards. The coffee pot sat on the counter, half full, waiting for morning. The yellow cabinets glowed in the lamplight. The curtain rod he'd installed 30 years ago still held its curtains, new fabric on old hardware, the way a family works new lives, growing on the frame the old ones built. Merritt reached into his shirt pocket. The brass key was there. Old tarnished, the leather tag worn to nothing. He didn't need it anymore. Artis never locked the door. She said there was no point. Anyone who needed to come in was welcome. But Merritt would carry this key until the day he died. Not because it opened anything, but because it was the weight of 20 years in his palm, the shape of every mistake he'd made and every door he'd been afraid to walk through. It was the last physical object connecting the man he'd been on the morning he left this house to the man he was now sitting on this porch with his great-grandson breathing against his shoulder, and his granddaughter studying to become something that would let her heal people, which was the only profession Merritt could imagine that was worthy of a woman who had spent 2 years healing him. Down the street, the houses were beginning to glow, porch lights coming on one by one as the evening deepened. The Whitaker house at number 31, Theron Presley's place across the road. The house 3 doors down where Merritt had fixed the dining table. One by one the street lit up, each light a small declaration that someone was home, someone was waiting. Someone had left a lamp burning against the dark. Merritt thought about Opal in the garden. He thought about Twyla at the kitchen table, writing in her journal by lamplight, recording the days Merritt was missing so he could read them when he came back. He thought about Artis at 22, standing in this doorway with a newborn in her arms and a promise she'd made to a dying woman, looking out at a street full of strangers and deciding to stay. He thought about a brass key carried through 20 years of concrete and fluorescent light and the grinding erosion of hope. About a box of letters written by a hand that wouldn't cooperate, each shaking line a refusal to let silence win. About a daughter who maintained tools she couldn't use and oiled blades she couldn't sharpen because she believed her father was coming home and would need them when he got there. They had kept the light on for him, all of them, in their own way for all those years. Opal with her letters, Twyla with the workshop, Artis with the house. Even Theron mowing the lawn and cleaning the gutters, keeping the place standing for a man he'd never met, on the faith of women who believed that man was worth waiting for. The porch light above Merritt's head cast a warm circle on the boards. Nolan shifted against his shoulder and sighed, the deep, boneless sigh of a child who is exactly where he belongs. Through the window, Artis turned a page in her textbook and reached for her tea. The radio played something soft from the kitchen counter. The evening settled around the house, quiet and warm and full. Merritt closed his eyes, and for the first time since the prison gates opened, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost, or what he'd wasted, or what he'd never get back. He was thinking about tomorrow, about Nolan at the workshop door with his toy hammer, about Artis's flashcards spread across the breakfast table, about the shelves he needed to finish for the woman with the 7 cats, about the garden that needed watering and the porch that needed sweeping and the coffee that needed grinding, about Corbin Whitaker's porch boards that still needed replacing and the conversation that might come with them, about Garnett picking him up on Monday morning for a cabinet job in Dayton, about Sunday afternoon at the cemetery standing between two stones telling Opal and Twyla about another week of the life they'd given back to him. About the small, ordinary things that make up a life when you finally stop running from it. Home isn't where you left your things. It's where someone left the light on for you. Merritt Caulfield held his great-grandson against his chest, and the street went quiet around them, and the porch lights burned steady in the dark, and the roses swayed in the evening air, and he rested.